Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, later this month, Labour's conference meets in Brighton, and anti-Brexit campaigners are preparing for a big push. Over the past couple of weeks, many of them have come to see Sir Keir Starmer, Jeremy Corbyn's Brexit spokesman, as an ally. Well, he's certainly shifted the policy on how we leave the EU. But is there more to it than that? He joins me now. Sir Keir.
Morning.
This is a big change of policy compared with, shall we say, the beginning of the summer where we were talking about it.
It's a really important development of our policy. We've always said jobs and the economy come first. We've always said we've got to retain the benefits of the single market and the customs union. What's clear now is the clock is ticking. And we are going to need transitional arrangements. The government at one stage was pretending we wouldn't need them. That having been the case, obviously it's important that we take leadership as to what are the terms of those transitional arrangements. And what we've said is the transitional period, i.e. from March 2019 until we get to a new and final deal, will be within a customs union and within the single market. Now, and there's absolute clarity about that, and it's a united Labour Party position, I'm very glad to say.
It is a U-turn, because it wasn't long ago that Jeremy Corbyn was sacking people for saying much the same thing.
No, it's not a U-turn. It's a development of our policy. On the question of what are the terms of the transitional arrangements, Labour has never said anything other than that we retain the benefits of the single market and the customs union. The argument that has been there is about what the final position is, but this is a development of the policy. It's an important development, and what's really important about this summer is that Labour has got to a united and a clear position. I think that is in the public interest. Because
so, to be absolutely clear, for a period of time after we have formally left the EU under Labour's plan, we'd be inside the single market and the customs union.
Yes.
So we would be paying money in as now, we'd have free movement as now, and would be subject to the European Court of Justice as now.
Yes, and let me explain why that is. Firstly, everybody says we've got to avoid a cliff edge. We need certainty and stability, and that is the way to achieve it. It is obvious that we need more time to resolve the position in Northern Ireland. That's a delicate position that is not just about the technicalities of the border. But also, there's an inevitability about this. The government is going so slowly in negotiations, there's a real risk that they're not going to get on to the phase 2 aspects. And to suggest, as some do, that you can have, as it were, bespoke special arrangements negotiated between now and March 2019 is nonsense. And so this is grown-up politics from the Labour Party in the public interest.
You say avoid a cliff edge, but under your plan, you just push the cliff edge a bit further away. I mean, there will be a cliff edge when we leave all these arrangements.
I accept that having interim arrangements is necessary, but of course we've got to look at what the end result will be as well, and that's why I say the interim arrangements should be as short as possible. I don't think temporary arrangements, whilst necessary, should go on for as long as any longer than is necessary.
So you say as short as possible. How long? Will these temporary arrangements be over by the time of the next election, for instance?
Well, I think they could be. And I genuinely think they should be as short as possible. They could be 2 years. They may take longer than that. What's really important is that what we're trying to achieve is a deal which is going to last for decades. And there are some big questions in there that are coming into very sharp focus, because that final deal is a deal where we are going to have to decide as a country, do we want to orientate ourselves around Europe, around the US, or around China, because they're the major trading bloc. Europe is our we share history, we share values, it's our major trading bloc. Now, of course, we will be out of the EU from March 2019, but the EU is the major focus for us on trading. We need to keep that very clearly in focus.
So, see, many people look at this plan to stay inside the single market and the customs union, and they think, aha, this is a way of effectively, over time, staying inside the EU. Perhaps the economy goes south for a while, perhaps an election has come with a different result, and then you get another chance at it. And therefore, all the anti-Brexit people are saying, Keir Starmer is giving us a way through.
But everybody knows, Andrew, that we leave the EU in March 2019. That's the obvious effect of triggering Article 50, and that will happen. The transitional measures are between that point and reaching a final, we say, positive partnership with Europe that recognises that Europe is our major trading partner.
But under your new plan, we are inside the single market and the customs union. We're paying in, we're under the ECJ and all the rest of it. It will feel very much as if we are still inside the EU, except we won't have votes. Tom Watson says this could be a permanent arrangement.
Well, I think we need to just put Tom Watson's remarks in context. And I don't want to get into the weeds of all this over and over again.
Into context or into a box?
Well, what we've said about the final arrangement is this. That we want a partnership with the EU that retains the benefits of the single market and the customs union. We are open to a discussion that leaves a customs union with the EU on the table as a viable option. We haven't swept it off the table.
This could be permanent.
We haven't swept that off the table. A customs union with the single with the EU and a changed relationship with the single market, because if you want to retain the benefits, you've got to be open to that discussion. We're not sweeping it off the table.
Okay. When you say a customs union with the EU and not the customs union, what do you mean?
Well, that's just because to be in the customs union, you must be an EU member, and therefore anything other than that is a customs union.
But we could replicate virtually exactly the situation now.
We could attempt to have an arrangement which delivered the benefits of the customs union that we now have through a customs union, and that is something which we think should be a viable end goal.
And if we are virtually inside the single market for the long term, what needs to change for that to be possible?
Well, I think there are issues, as I've always said, about freedom of movement. There are wider issues than that. But on freedom of movement and this question of is it going to be a freedom of movement during the transitional period, the government's commissioned, as you know, a review of immigration. That review's not even going to report until well into next year. The chances of a brand new immigration policy by March 2019 are zero.
Nonetheless, we're in the situation where, under this plan, we'll be inside the EU in many respects during this transitional page, but we won't have any votes, and we won't be able to strike deals around the rest of the world, as Theresa May was trying to do in Japan, and David Davis has been to the States and all the rest of it. Is this not the worst of all possible worlds? As
a short-term basis, it will work. I accept the argument that we won't have votes. In fact, most of the provisions that will be coming into force during that 2 or 3 year period will be provisions that we will have had a say on. But I'm not pretending that transitionals are ideal. They are necessary, but they should be as short as possible.
Absolutely crucial question. Are you saying that we could stay inside the single market for the long term? Could?
I'm saying we should have we should have as a viable option a changed relationship with the single market that delivers the benefits of the single market. Full membership, the membership we have now, is there because we're an EU member.
We can't be full members.
We are leaving the EU in March 2019. The question is, can we have a construct and arrangement which truly delivers the benefits of the single market? And that's what we're focused on. OK, now let's turn to the parliamentary arguments, because you have written a letter to David Davis which sets out a whole series of objections you have to the Great Repeal Bill, as it's being called. Yeah, well, it's a very, very wide-sweeping bill. The idea of converting EU law into our law is right, but the way the government's gone about it is completely wrong. They want sweeping powers that effectively take powers from Brussels and put them into the hands of ministers. This is the so-called Henry VIII. Well, Henry VIII, I mean, I'm sure many people won't necessarily know what Henry VIII built. But Henry VIII didn't much like Parliament, and therefore he issued proclamations which could amend legislation. And ever since then, the use of these sorts of powers has been highly controversial. What this bill has is the power to make delegated legislation that actually can change primary legislation without Parliament having the usual scrutiny over it. Now, that's really, really important, because you could entrench important EU rights on Monday and take them away on Tuesday without primary legislation. Now, the David Davis of old wouldn't have had much to do with that. What they say, on the other hand, is that to avoid the cliff edge, to avoid chaos, so business and everybody else knows where we are, you have to wholesale take all those EU regulations and pass them into British law. And essentially, this is what this bill is doing. And if you destroy this bill, if you defeat this bill in the House of Commons, we are in a completely chaotic situation. This is not about frustrating the process. It is not giving the government a blank cheque to pass powers into the hands of ministers. And even when it comes to transitional measures, the bill makes clear that the role of, for example, of the European Court of Justice will be extinguished. We might say, well, that's consistent with leaving, but it puts the date of extinguishing into the hands of the Secretary of State, not Parliament. These are very, very wide powers, and we can't just give a blank cheque to the government. There's one question
I'm sorry, we can't go through all of your objections because there's 6 of them in 60. If David Davis sits down with you but does not accept all your points, are you definitely going to vote against this bill?
We have said that I flagged these points up at the beginning of the summer and said if you don't address them, we will be voting against it. Now, we haven't reached that stage yet, but I've been very, very clear. Whilst we accept the result of the referendum, we are not giving a blank cheque to the government to do it in whichever way it wants, because it's not in the public interest.
For those many people inside the Labour Party who dream perhaps of Brexit being properly reversed and are staying inside the EU, we're now in the situation with this new change in policy whereby we might stay pretty much inside the single market and the customs union, according to Tom Watson, long term. What's your message to them?
We have always said we accept the outcome of the referendum. We want a progressive partnership going forward. Somehow we have to come up with arrangements which properly reflects the vote but brings the country back together. And that's about big ticket items, which is what is your basic trading relationship with Europe, and what else can you do with the rest of the world, and how do you collaborate and cooperate more widely?
You're going to be fighting on the floor of the House of Commons, not just on the so-called Henry VIII powers, but many other issues. Do you have Tory support?
Well, there are many Tories who I think are very concerned about the position that the government finds itself in, which is pretty shambolic. There's very slow progress in the negotiation. And I think some of them this summer will be looking across the Labour Party and thinking, well, they've got a clearer, more coherent position than we have now.
It's going to be a very interesting few weeks.
It certainly is.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, this week's news, as you've heard, has been dominated by those Brexit negotiations. Very sadly for us, the EU negotiators are so far very camera shy, so we can't ask them quite why they're so worried and disdainful of the British approach. But David Davis, Cabinet Minister in charge of Brexit, who this week warned of more turbulence ahead, but said he was still confident of a good deal, is here and not camera shy.
Well known to be camera shy, that's right.
So let's start with these negotiations, because Mr Barnier was quite tough about how he thought very, very little progress, time is running out, you're not being entirely serious. He was quite hostile to the way you've conducted these negotiations.
Well, I mean, he can take whatever line he likes on the way we conduct the negotiations. That's up to us, not up to him. But to give you an example of progress, I mean, when I was last on your show, I talked about the need to guarantee the health care for people who are currently in Europe. We did that last week. You know, we want to extend it to everybody. We wanted the EHIC scheme, the card scheme that you take with you when you go on holiday. We want to extend it to everybody.
That, have you?
But we've agreed it for people in Europe, you know, the British citizens in Spain or Italy or France or wherever. That's agreed. That's done. You know, very important, incredibly important. Social Security contributions for these people, all now agreed. You know, other things which sound
there already, is it?
Yeah, this for people. They're the only thing they'll talk about at the moment. This is the point about the Europeans. They won't talk about the future. They'll only talk about so-called, well, divorce proceedings, if you like. Things like, I mean, there are lots and lots of technical stuff. Sounds terribly technical. Frontier workers. Oh, well, so what? Actually, if you're a British citizen living in Holland, working in Germany, or living in France, working in Belgium, this matters to you, that your job matters. Those things we've been resolving. What he's concerned about, of course, is he's not getting the answer on money. And they've set this up to try and create pressure on us on money. That's what it's about. They're trying to play time against money. That's exactly what they're doing.
Are you being blackmailed in that regard?
No, I don't. You know, what's going on, and it's quite important because there are all sorts of stories flying around. You had them in the papers this morning. Which
£50 billion
it's
bill.
I mean, it's nonsense. The story is completely wrong.
Well, I'll come on to it later.
Okay, all right. But you know, what we're doing, for example, on this, I mean, the approach we're taking is we are saying, okay, you've given this enormous bill. It's a bit like if you're leaving a hotel, you've got an enormous bill. You go through line by line.
But
That's what we're doing.
You don't hop off before you've paid it.
No. But you go through line by line. That's what we're doing. They're saying, oh, well, give us a counter. It's like as though the sort of hotels say, well, make an offer. No, we're not doing that. We're going through line by line. And they're finding it difficult because we've got good lawyers. We gave them a 2.5-hour presentation. They even complained about that. So we are basically going through this very systematically, very British way, very pragmatic way of doing it. And of course, he's finding it difficult. And he wants to put pressure on us, which is why the stance this week in the press conference. Bluntly, I think it looked a bit silly because there plainly were things that we've achieved, plainly things we've achieved, but
Barney
they weren't.
was looking a bit silly.
Yeah, but the commission, not so much him. I mean, I like him. I've known him for 20 years. But the commission puts itself in a silly position if it says there's nothing been done when these really important things. You know, we put people before process. What they're in danger of doing is putting process before people.
This is not going terribly well. He thinks you're nostalgic, you think he's silly, and time is running out.
No, I didn't say he's silly. Don't put words in my mouth. I said the Commission can make itself look silly by this. Now, look, time is not running out. This is a 2-year negotiating period. They are trying to use time against us. I said, you quoted me, this is going to be turbulent. This is the first ripple. And, you know, people shouldn't panic.
So more trouble ahead.
People shouldn't. Look, this is a sequence. Every single time we come to something serious, there will be a pressure exercise of this sort. You know, money is incredibly important to them. It's the thing that frightens them most is the money issue. But there are other big ones along the way, and they will. You know, each time there'll be a pressure point. Each time you'll see a flurry of nervousness. But the truth is, we'll get through it and we'll get a good deal.
Let me ask you then about the money. Jacob Rees-Mogg says, actually, if we just leave without an agreement, we owe not a penny.
Well, there is the strict position is there is no enforceable thing. But what we've said all along is we are a country that meets its international obligations. But they've got to be that. I mean, there may not be legal ones, there may be moral ones, there may be political ones, but we meet our international obligations. Also, we want to leave in an orderly and smooth manner. Well, I don't come back to that in a minute. But in order to do that, it's best if you leave on amicable terms, it's best if you leave on proper terms and negotiated terms, and don't just walk away. There are issues if you just walk away. You know, it can be done, but there are issues involved in it. Our view is we're aiming for a smooth, sensible, amicable exit, which leaves us and leaves the European Union in a good position.
Now, clearly money remains a big problem. You said earlier on the £50 billion figure is completely wrong. But you must know by now, roughly speaking, in your back pocket what that hotel bill is going to cost you.
Well, look, the first thing to say is the approach we're taking is as I described earlier. It's a line by line go through the exercise. That won't be the end of the approach. I mean, we'll then be talking about what happens next. Now, we have said in terms the era of big payments to the European Union is coming to an end. We'll still be paying something, I suspect. I mean, we've got measures like all the space research stuff, all of the research stuff, all of the issues on nuclear research.
What about money to Ukraine?
Horizon 2020.
What about money to Africa and the Caribbean?
That's a different matter.
That?
That's a different matter. You know, bear in mind.
But
I mean,
we did agree these budgets originally, didn't we?
Well, if
you might say there's a moral obligation.
If you've ever, well, that's the argument. I mean, in a sense, what the European Union is saying is it's a legal obligation. We're saying no, it's not. You know, but yeah, in the medium to long term, we're not going to be paying great big payments. That's the point.
But if you walk away from your phone contract, for instance, then you expect to be stung for the cost of that contract.
Because it's a legal contract. And that's what we've been through. We've been through a legal argument, basically, and we're still going through it. And basically, I mean, the simple truth is, you know, we have got strong legal arguments to say what they've said so far is not right. So that's why they're getting nervous.
We're not very many weeks away from the Tory party conference, and a lot of people turning up there will want to know, roughly speaking, how much we're going to be paying. No. Is there going to be any chance they will be told then?
What they'll want is that we get a good deal. Not that we talk about a good deal, but we get a good deal. Now, this is the most complex negotiation probably ever, but certainly of modern times. And you don't get a negotiated outcome by laying everything. So this is what we want, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to pay, and so on. It doesn't work like that.
You see, the trouble is, during the referendum campaign and shortly afterwards, you told us that this would be a straightforward negotiation. You gave the impression it would be a bit of a breeze, and it's appearing to be absolutely the opposite.
Now, what I said was the strategy is straightforward. Some of it would be quite complicated. That's the exact phrase I used in the last article.
What you said was. There's a very easy, then you say no, not easy, but a very straightforward negotiation, and you said we are certain to get a good deal. Do you still feel that?
I still think we'll get a good deal, yeah. That's what we're aiming for. That's what this is about.
Do you think you'll be able to get through phase one, this very important and difficult phase one, by October for the summit, where that was the timing that we were going to get onto?
That's Barnier's timing. They said that's what they want to do. And ideally, we'll be in a position to. We'll have made their phrase is sufficient progress. The point is it's their decision on sufficient progress, not our decision on sufficient progress. I've just told you some of the things we've got through. That's just this round. And there's more to go, there's September and October itself. So they'll make a call. But I'm not going to allow them to use the time pressure on that to somehow force us into doing X or Y or Z. That's why I said to you, whenever you have a pressure point in these things,
sure,
there'll be issues coming out your way, like that question.
When you were so confident during the referendum campaign, one of the reasons you were confident, you kept saying, who's the most powerful politician? It's Angela Merkel. Now, you're not negotiating with Angela Merkel, you're negotiating with Michel Barnier. First of all, do you detect any frustration in the rest of the EU about the way the Commission is handling this negotiation?
Well, if I did, I wouldn't talk about it on air. I mean, look,
Sounds like a yes.
It sounds like as I said, don't put words in my mouth. Angela Merkel is facing a general election in 3 or 4 weeks' time, I think it is. During October, when we come to the next round, there may or may not be a German government in place.
Well, there will be a German government.
Well, the newly negotiated outcome. I mean, and it sometimes takes months. And that will, of course, have its own effect on timetable too. You know, and what you don't want to do is to put some, whether it's money or anything else, something on the table, and then suddenly have that pocketed and say, that's not good enough, we're going to go back and do some more. These negotiations are complex and sophisticated, and you must be very, very wary of just thinking, oh, if we just ask this. The Labour Party, you've had Keir Starmer on, say, oh, well, just do this and just do that. Actually, everything has a negotiating effect, and they're not allowing for that in their calculations.
So this is very, very difficult. There's a very interesting story in the Sunday Telegraph today suggesting that actually we may well not get a deal, that it was quite a high proportion of the problems over money and the border and all the rest of it, we may not make it, and that therefore we should be planning very, very carefully. The Cabinet Minister saying we have to have a really careful, proper plan. Otherwise, we can't call their bluff.
We're planning for all options. Indeed, Mervyn King said something similar about a month ago. We're planning for all options. We're not particularly publicising it, because every time you publicise something like that, people say, oh, look, they're trying to get a no-deal outcome. That isn't the case. We're absolutely putting all our effort into getting a good deal outcome, and we think that is by far and away the highest probability, by far and away. But we have to plan for every option.
But as you walk into Brussels, you fly into Brussels, you think each time, it is possible this is not going to work.
There's a possibility. It's a negotiation, but the system may get in the way. And you've got about 15 elections in the course of the period going on, so you've got all sorts of noises off. But the simple truth to keep at the back of your mind, 2015, the latest numbers are bigger, but in 2015, we sold about 230 billion to them, euros. They sold about 290 billion to us. Yeah. The Belgian economy, the Dutch economy, well, you say that, but some of them, it's very, very important. The Belgian economy is important to the and parts of Germany. I mean, the richest and biggest part of Germany is Bavaria. And
so
BMW, agriculture,
Isn't
everything.
it the case, therefore, that actually Barnier is negotiating with a very tight series of rules he's been given by the 27?
That is true.
And actually the really big political decisions, without which a breakthrough won't happen, are going to be made in Paris, in Berlin, in Vienna and in other European countries.
They'll be made in the Council, technically. But you're right, the big players will be very important in this. And what's been interesting, I mean, one of the groups I thought I was nervous of is the wrong word, but I was cautious of where they were going, were the French. I think the French are actually looking at this, I mean, brand new government, still coming in, still getting itself bedded in, looking at this with a very constructive viewpoint. I mean, we're seeing lots of optimistic noises coming back across, but we have to respect the process, deal with the Commission, and then, of course, put it in such a way that the Council comes back and says, this is worth doing. You know?
We're beginning to run out of time, but I must ask you about Parliament, because that is the big crunch now. Is it really the case that those Tory MPs, who quite like what they hear from Keir Starmer about staying inside the single market and the customs union for a transitional arrangement, and are quite worried about the number of powers that ministers are engorging in the process of this shifting of legislation across, are you really saying that if they back Labour in amendments in the House of Commons, they're going to let in Jeremy Corbyn?
There's an even more important issue at the centre of this than even that. We made plain, this bill is there in order to enable continuity. If you want a soft Brexit, and I don't actually deal with soft and hard Brexit. I want an effective and successful Brexit. But if you want something like continuity, this is the bill you should be supporting. It takes, as somebody said on your sofa earlier, it takes the laws that are there now and puts them in place the day after we leave. I think it was Caroline Flint who said it. So that's the first thing to understand. It's not just a question of the sort of national politics. It's a question of what's right. Secondly, the proposals. I mean, poor old Keir Starmer, he comes on here. I'm negotiating with Brussels. He's negotiating with the rest of his party.
Quite successfully.
And well, we see this is the 7th or 8th or 9th position, depending on how you count them. He's been in 12 months. And Tom Watson's proposal that we're staying in the single market in perpetuity is a direct refutation, a direct rebuttal of what they promised their own voters in the last election. They said they're going to support Brexit and put it through. What Watson is saying effectively, and he's an old mate of mine, as you well know, he's saying, no, we're going to carry on with this, we're going to stay in the single market. Yeah. You can't do that if deal with immigration.
Reform, he says. But nevertheless, let's get real. What's going on here is that Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour leadership understand that if they're going to pull down your government, the only way they can do it is over this issue. So they are going to try and destroy you in the House of Commons.
And they've gone in for the most cynical approach. They know this bill is necessary, and they've gone in for it. I mean, Starmer even admitted that to you. They also know that the claims they make are nonsense. They're Henry VIII powers. He made it sound as though we're suddenly a grand... The Constitution...
Dominic Grieve, a former colleague of yours,
let me go
Tory
to an
backbencher, agrees with him on this.
An even greater... Yeah, Dominic hasn't come up with an alternative, and neither has Keir Starmer. The best authority on this is the Constitutional Committee of the House of Lords. Very strong Remainer body of the House of Lords, and the Constitutional Committee said this is the way it has to be done. You have to have secondary legislation. This isn't taking powers.
So Tory MPs who are thinking of voting with the opposition on this legislation, what's your last brief message to them?
My brief message to them is everything that's significant in terms of changes, not technical changes, but significant changes, will be done in separate primary legislation. Immigration bills, customs bills, you name it. This bill is about ensuring continuity. Anybody, reliever or Remainer, should support this bill.
And when you saw that Theresa May, whose conduct of the last general election campaign you weren't totally happy with, is determined to fight the next one, did your heart lift?
She's a great Prime Minister, I think. I've served her the last 12 months. I have been never anything less than impressed in the way she runs the country. That's what matters. That's what matters to the people, not the politics running the country. And she does a good job.
David Davis, thanks very much for talking to us.
OK, well, let's bring you more reaction to North Korea launching the latest nuclear test. We've had reaction now from President Donald Trump. He has been tweeting this morning. He has said North Korea has conducted a major nuclear test. Their words and actions continue to be very hostile and dangerous to the United States. So this is the first reaction we're getting from President Trump in reaction to North Korea launching that nuclear test overnight. Of course, he has spoken of fire and fury towards North Korea if they continued with their nuclear and weapons program. But the reaction he's giving so far on Twitter, we will try and get more on that if indeed there is more reaction from the president. OK, but for now, let's return to our top story on Brexit. Now, as Parliament prepares to debate the Brexit bill this Thursday, Labour's expected to push for changes which would keep the UK in the single market and customs union during a transition period after 2019 when we leave the EU. But Shadow Brexit Secretary Keir Starmer has failed to say when a clean break would be achieved.
But a transitional measure is necessary. Of course, it's not ideal. But I think we need to drop the pretense that somehow the negotiations, all of the negotiations, are going to be finished by March 2019. You've only got to look at what's been happening last week to see that there is no prospect of that.
I mean, could you earmark a date for the ending of that transition?
No, of course I can't. It depends what the negotiations are within that period of time. But it should be as short as possible because I don't think temporary arrangements are very good for the country as a whole. We need to move forward.
Well, meanwhile, a new report suggests that the lowest paid workers could benefit from a clean Brexit as a result of lower food prices and restrictions on unskilled migrants. One of the organisations behind the report is Labour Leave, and the chair of that is John Mills, who joins me now from Newbury. First of all, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Could you talk to us about this report? This is a report showing that potentially working families could benefit from the UK leaving the EU.
Yes, I think that's right. I think we've had an enormous amount of doom and gloom from many people about what the economic prospects are, and no attention paid to where the benefits could lie. But certainly much cheaper food, which would be possible outside the customs union, would benefit poorer people even more than richer people in this country. And there is a problem at the lower end of the labour market with labour competition, and if that was restricted in a reasonable way by reducing immigration, especially from Eastern Europe, poorer people in this country would be better off.
So you're pointing to the immigrant, quote-unquote, problem in regards to workers and immigrant workers coming to the UK, taking jobs. Is this your argument? This is the reason why you say working people in the UK will benefit from a Brexit?
Yes, I think that's right. I think one of the problems we've had over the last year or two is that investment has been very low because there have been so many people willing to come and work in this country for quite low wages. That companies have been under no pressure to invest in labour-saving equipment. And I think that that would change if there was some restrictions on immigration to the benefit of the economy as a whole, but also to the benefit of British people who are competing for these jobs.
So then, what is your reaction then to Keir Starmer talking about now a transitional period where the UK stays within the single market, stays within the customs union for a number of years, 2 years up to maybe 4 years, while we're leaving the EU? Could this potentially cause problems for those working families you say could benefit from the UK leaving the EU?
Well, I think the problem about staying in the EU is that we go on with the problems we've had for many years. I mean, part of these have been around immigration, part of them have been around the control over the British economy by the Luxembourg court. But a lot of the problem is just the cost. And the problem is the longer we stay in the European Union, the more the costs are going to ramp up. And that can't be good for the British economy. We have an enormous balance of payments deficit with the European Union, and that's exacerbated by the fact that we pay in 11 or 12 billion pounds every year. And the longer this goes on, the more the British economy will suffer.
So if not a transitional period, what would be the other option? Obviously, it would be a cliff edge exit, which the argument is would be good for nobody.
Well, I think it depends a bit on how that pans out. I mean, the original intention of the government, which I support, was that we should come out of the customs union, come out of the single currency, come out of the EEA and negotiate a free trade deal with the European Union 27, and I think that would still be the best outcome. But I think that may not turn out to be possible. But if it is not achieved, the WTO, the World Trade Organization tariffs, which you then have to pay, are relatively low, in the 2.5% or something, and I don't think that would be the end of the world. It would certainly be a lot cheaper than paying in huge sums of money every year, year after year, which unfortunately is one of the consequences of the policy that's been advocated during this transitional period.
I mean, isn't this your party going back on a key manifesto promise here to leave the EU? And there was no mention of a transitional period, of staying in the single market and the customs union.
Well, I think to be fair, at the time it wasn't envisaged exactly what the timing on the exit process would be. And there obviously has got to be something done if we run up against March 2019 and negotiations aren't completed. And then I think there is a choice either of having some sort of transitional arrangements or having a hard Brexit. I think which way we should then go will depend very much on what the costs of the transitional arrangement actually turn out to be. And if they're too high, if it was £100 billion, for example, I think a lot of people would say, well, that's just too much, and we're better off with a hard Brexit.
Yeah, we still don't know that cost just yet. Hopefully we will find out sometime soon. John Mills, good talking to you. Thank you. Well, to get more on this, let's speak to our political correspondent, Tom Rayner, who's in Westminster for us this afternoon. And this is some pretty tough fighting talk from David Davis, and following a very bruising week of those Brexit talks.
Yeah, he clearly feels stung by the criticism of how he's been handling the negotiations in Brussels, and used that interview to try and fire back at some of his critics, both in Brussels and indeed in Westminster. And I think what he was trying to do there when he was emphasising that this time pressure, this idea that the clock is ticking, is put in context the comments from Mr Barnier so that people here in the UK see them for what they are. And he is clearly suggesting that it's a strategy, it's a tactic, if you like, of Barnier to create a time pressure that will force the UK to agree to a Brexit divorce bill. Because as Mr. Davis put it in that interview, the EU have a situation where money frightens them. They want an answer on that divorce bill before they move forward. Now, Mr. Davis described the reports in the Sunday Times today that the government is preparing to agree to a £50 billion Brexit divorce bill, which they would have announced after the party conference as nonsense. However, he did acknowledge that there were, even if not legal obligations to pay some kind of settlement, that there may be political and moral obligations, and that the UK is a country which is prepared to honour obligations. So some indication that a settlement is possible, but clearly suggesting that he's not going to be strong-armed into any agreement just on the issue of time pressure. But actually what's interesting when we think about what's going to be happening in Parliament later this week on Thursday, the second reading of the EU withdrawal bill, is that Mr. Davis is taking a sort of opposite position. He's saying with regards to Brussels, the clock is ticking but time isn't running out, whereas in Parliament there simply isn't time for the kind of objections that Labour are raising with regards to that, what was once called the Great Repeal Bill. Labour have concerns over the so-called Henry VIII clauses, which are powers that would be given to ministers to allow them to pass legislation that would not get a great deal of scrutiny perhaps from MPs. They think that that must be changed before they can back the bill. Mr. Davis is saying there isn't time for that. This is a very pragmatic bill that is needed in order to maintain legal continuity, as he put it, to ensure that there is a functioning legal framework on the day after Brexit by transposing EU laws into UK domestic laws. But much as he has responded to Mr. Barnier by saying, I'm not going to be pressured by your time claims, Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, saying something kind of similar, that this is big, important stuff with long-lasting impact, and Labour is not going to give the government a blank cheque to just push through whatever legislation it thinks through Parliament, that it will fight it tooth and nail in terms of making sure that there are sufficient democratic guarantees in place.
OK, Tom, thank you.
Well, let's go back to those Brexit talks, and I'm joined now by the Liberal Democrat spokesperson on Brexit, Tom Brake. Mr Brake, thanks a lot for joining us this afternoon. The EU withdrawal bill is going to be starting its journey through the Commons on Thursday. You've said that this bill will drive a coach and horses through parliamentary sovereignty. Why is that?
Well, because the powers that it gives to the government are very, very excessive. I've written to 18 members of Parliament who, in January last year, and these were Brexit supporters, who said that they believe that parliamentary sovereignty was key to the EU negotiations. I have written to them a couple of days ago to say I agree, and that parliamentary sovereignty is being crushed by this particular bill, and I hope therefore that they will support amendments that seek to give Parliament power in relation to this bill, rather than giving it over to the government, for the government giving government powers to really railroad through legislation without Parliament having a say-so.
The letter, have you had any responses from those MPs, or do you think it's going to be largely ignored?
Well, I've had a deafening silence so far, but maybe people are still on holiday or it's the weekend, but I hope they deal with this or treat this seriously, because they are on record saying that parliamentary sovereignty is something that is critical. For instance, the Member of Parliament, Bill Cash, has really spent his whole political career campaigning on this issue. This bill, whether you look at lawyers or constitutional experts, they are very clear that this bill gives government power, for instance, to set up new agencies, in other words, to change policy without Parliament having a say, without the proper bill process of both the Commons and the Lords looking at it. These powers are unacceptable, and that's why I hope they will join with me and other members of Parliament of all parties in saying this is not acceptable. If we are taking back control of our laws, then Parliament has got to be sovereign in relation to the EU withdrawal bill, and that is certainly not the case at present.
Well, you said the government's approach of constructive ambiguity, as described by David Davis, is looking increasingly like destructive complacency. You've said businesses need reassurances. Surely this bill is giving them that?
Well, this is a timetable that the government have chosen. It's of their own making. I don't think that in a country that has the mother of all parliaments, that we should be allowing the government to say, well, we've put ourselves in this very difficult position, we have got very little time, and therefore we're going to set aside parliamentary democracy to ram something through. I don't think that's acceptable. I think the government have got to allow Parliament to have a greater say. There are means by which they can do this in terms of procedures that allow a much greater degree of scrutiny of these bills, and they should certainly not be allowing agencies, for instance, to be set up which are responsible for policy. They should not allow those to be set up without Parliament going through the proper bill process.
What means, Mr. Brake?
Sorry?
What means?
I missed that.
What means? You spoke of means.
Sorry, I couldn't.
We're just talking over each other now. You said that there were means by which this bill would be able to go through and provide parliamentary sovereignty. What are those means?
Well, for instance, many of the legislative changes are going to come through statutory instruments, so secondary legislation. There are powers, for instance, there's a procedure called the super affirmative procedure, which would ensure not only that Parliament would have a say, but actually provides time to enable other organisations that have an interest in those legislative changes, whether they're things to do with environment or workers' rights, allows them the time to have input into that process, but the current procedure the government are adopting would not allow that to happen, and it would simply be something that a parliamentary committee of a small number of members of Parliament would be able to consider, rather than opening it up to the wider society, who have some very strong views on some of the changes the government are proposing.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but Tom Brake, thank you so much, the Lib Dem Brexit spokesperson.
So this was the week that the Brexit negotiations got serious. A refusal to move on from the divorce talks, accusations of inflexibility on both sides, and today petty comments about the silly EU Commission and how Britain will be educated in the cost of leaving. Next week promises to be equally divisive when the government's Brexit repeal bill is debated in Parliament. So where does all the posturing that we've heard in the last few days get us? Joining me from West Yorkshire is the Labour MEP Richard Corbett. Mr Corbett, good evening to you. So where does it get us?
Well, it's all illustrative of the chaos and confusion surrounding the whole Brexit process, frankly. I mean, remember, it took nearly a year after the referendum to get the negotiations started because of divisions within Britain and the British government as to what it actually wanted to secure, which is still not very clear. At the very first meeting of the negotiations, the British government didn't put a single document on the table, a single set of demands or requests, unlike the EU side, which had published its requests and ideas in advance. So I think there'll be quite some way to go, but primarily it's up to the British government to sort out what it wants to ask for and then to negotiate seriously to get them.
Is it not also up to the EU side and the EU Commission to say what they want to ask for? They keep talking about this money. They themselves haven't given a figure. Michel Barnier saying that they're going to educate us in the cost. Mud being slung from both sides. Do you not accept that both sides are being equally frustrating here?
Well, the EU side has at least put a paper on the table saying how this should be calculated. What sort of things is Britain still liable for? What things is it not still liable for? So that at least they have done. And don't forget, that's just one of the issues. There's the question of the rights of citizens, British citizens in the rest of Europe, EU citizens living in Britain. What will happen to their rights? All these things need to be settled step by step. The timetable was agreed by both sides at the beginning, saying that the strictly necessary, legally necessary divorce things need to be settled first, and then you can talk about the future relationship. The sooner you get those things out of the way, the more time there is to discuss that future relationship. So that if we go ahead with Brexit...
Why has Mr Barnier not produced a position paper on Northern Ireland then?
Well, the UK-Ireland common travel area is something that the EU has said it wants to keep, and it wants to have that as frictionless a border as possible. Of course, it might become difficult to keep it as a frictionless border if we decide to leave the customs union, and then it becomes the external customs border of the European Union. So there'd be big problems there, but that's a British decision that we're still awaiting for. So if we indeed go ahead with Brexit, which some people are beginning to question when it looks as though it's going to be such a costly, damaging exercise for the British economy. If we go ahead with it, we've got to sort out these and 1,000 other issues as quickly as possible.
What do you make of this touted figure of about £50 billion that some of the newspapers here in the UK say is the amount that Theresa May is going to offer the EU, but she's probably going to do it after the Conservative Party conference?
Well, I think it's all speculative. Neither side has put figures on the table so far. It's all about what are the items for which the UK, having committed to them jointly as an EU member up to now, might still be liable for its share of payments afterwards. Once you've identified the categories, you can then add up what they all add up to. And on the other side of the equation, what share of assets Britain might get back or ask to get back from the properties and other assets of the European Union on the other side of the equation. That's what they've got to work out. That's what they're looking at the moment. Nobody has yet put a figure on that. You first have to decide what goes into that pot.
We've got to get to the stage in October where we finally move things on. Do you think that's likely to happen?
The latest developments seem to mean it's far less likely that they will be ready in time for October. Things have been going painfully slowly.
But do you not think that, well, let's put it a simple way, 13 months to get things done if we stick to that timetable? Can you see a point where both sides say, listen, this is going to need to take more time?
I can very much see that being the case, and that can be done in two ways. Either you prolong the negotiations, you need unanimity to extend the 2-year period, or you have a very minimal divorce saying you leave the EU in March 2019, but everything stays the same for another 2 or 3 years while we negotiate and sort out the future relationship. The problem with that is that you're inviting the British Parliament to buy a pig in a poke, as we say in English, to accept something, not yet knowing the full consequences of it, not knowing what the future relationship's going to be. And I think that would be a big democratic challenge for the British Parliament.
OK, Mr Corbett, must leave it there, but thank you for your time.
Here, the Brexit Secretary David Davis has said that the European Commission is making itself look silly by saying that talks with Britain aren't making progress. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, says that he doesn't want to punish or blackmail the UK, but that the British people need to understand the extremely serious consequences of leaving. This week, Theresa May faces a parliamentary battle with the first Commons debate on Brexit legislation. Our political correspondent Chris Mason reports.
The UK and the EU, David Davis and Michel Barnier, still some way apart after 3 rounds of talks. A huge sticking point is money. Today, Mr Davis insisted the UK would not be pressured into paying more than its fair share.
We are basically going through this very systematically, very British way, very pragmatic way of doing it, and of course he's finding it difficult. And he wants to put pressure on us, which is why the stance this week in the press conference. Bluntly, I think it looked a bit silly because there plainly were things that we've achieved.
Une sorte de nostalgie. And yes, there were spiky exchanges between the two men at last week's news conference. Mr Barnier has since spent the weekend here at a conference on the banks of Lake Como in Italy. He said he does not want to blackmail the UK, but added, there are extremely serious consequences of leaving the single market, and it hasn't been explained to the British people. We intend to teach people what leaving the single market means. The future of Europe is more important than Brexit. Far more important. Meanwhile, the rows about leaving the EU return here this week. The planned new law that's needed to make it happen will be discussed in the Commons. And remember, the Prime Minister's parliamentary predicament is precarious. She nurses a tiny majority. And that's why the debate on repealing this, the act that took us into the EU, matters so much. Labour says it will vote against the law as planned, which will eventually be stored here, unless substantial changes are made, including protecting workers' rights.
I flagged these points up at the beginning of the summer and said if you don't address them, we will be voting against it. Now, we haven't reached that stage yet, but I've been very, very clear. Whilst we accept the result of the referendum, we are not giving a blank cheque to the government to do it in whichever way it wants, because it's not in the public interest.
This means any rebellion from just a handful of Conservative MPs would leave the Prime Minister in real trouble. Discussions on delivering Brexit are getting rather blustery. Chris Mason, BBC News at Westminster.
Now here, the Brexit Secretary David Davis has accused Brussels of having a silly approach to the talks on the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. He was speaking as Theresa May sought to head off reports of a Tory rebellion ahead of the first Commons votes on the Brexit legislation, the so-called EU Withdrawal Bill, on Thursday. Paul McNamara has this report.
The UK does not feel legally obliged to honour his obligations after departure.
That's what the EU's chief negotiator had to say on Friday. Michel Barnier's tone hasn't softened any in the last 2 days, apparently, telling journalists in an off-camera briefing Brexit is an opportunity to, quote, teach the British people and others what leaving the EU means.
Anyway, tell me about the week.
Yeah, but actually, kind of across all of the different strands, I think we've made progress pretty much everywhere.
The Brits see things differently. Talk of any stalemate on a divorce bill is EU bluster, says David Davis. He's progressing pragmatically, he said today, while his counterparts risk looking silly.
We are basically going through this very systematically, very British way, very pragmatic way of doing it, and of course he's finding it difficult. And he wants to put pressure on us, which is why the stance this week in the press conference. Bluntly, I think it looked a bit silly because there plainly were things that we've achieved.
It's not just negotiators on the EU side of this table that think talks aren't moving fast enough. Labour, who now say they back a transitional deal keeping the UK in the customs union and the single market, say the government's team is in disarray.
We should be at the point of having agreed or be near agreement on the principles, and I am very worried. They're all over the place, with many different positions coming out from different cabinet members, so Labour has a coherent approach to this.
Not the assessment the Prime Minister needs heading back from trade talks in Japan to a key Commons vote on Brexit. She's called for unity among her own MPs as this week Parliament votes on the EU Withdrawal Bill, adopting 40 years' worth of EU statutes into UK law. But with no guarantee of Labour backing it and only a handful of Tory MPs needed to derail her flagship Brexit bill, the PM's first week back from recess could be a long one.